Our words are by Reverend Leslie Takahashi. Here in this place of peace, may we find hope. Here in this place of connection, may we find life-giving connection. Here in this place of rest, let the unrest of our hearts turn us toward justice. Here in this place made sacred by memories of connection, let us feel ourselves part of the new that grows from the old in the spiraling unity of the years. Amen, shalom, salam, namaste, and blessed be. I'll make a confession before I start the sermon that I really had to keep rewriting this sermon to keep up with current events. So much has happened to this nation in the last 2 weeks. As I describe my hometown, you might assume that I grew up in the deep south of the United States. My hometown did not allow people of color, any color other than white, to buy a home and live in it during the heady days of growth after World War II. Because of my very white social location, I did not have an interaction with an African-American person until I was about 7 years old. Pre-war, my parents were from small towns in the Midwest. The place where they raised our family is not far from here, Garden Grove, just up the 405 freeway. Garden Grove, the city that would not allow gold medal swimming champion Dr. Sammy Lee to purchase a home in the 1950s because he was Asian American, is now nicknamed Little Saigon, both by the city and by the very diverse population. The arc of the universe does sometimes bend toward justice. During the 1950s, Garden Grove's white city fathers, and they were men, severely restricted who could move into its borders. Most of the people who purchased the new homes were of Euro-American descent, and we lived together with smaller populations of Japanese American and Latino families, many of whom had lived there for generations. My parents were political liberals, a rare thing in conservative Orange County of the 1950s and 60s. As an adult, I thought I had escaped from a racist upbringing by growing up with them. But now I think back and I remember the demeaning names and half-joking insinuations about different ethnic groups that were sometimes sprinkled into the day-to-day life of our family by my educated, middle-class parents, both of whom worked in public education, was indeed racism. I remember things said by my white classmates at school, very cruel words about people of color. I did not escape the overt racism of Orange County by simply growing up. I now live in one of the bastions of right-wing extremism in Orange County, as reported by the Los Angeles Times newspaper last week. I am a longtime resident of Huntington Beach, California. When the recent reports of the shooting murders of the Asian women in Atlanta appeared in the news, I felt a familiar anger and sadness. A young man with a gun, pumped up with self-loathing and ugly rhetoric, sees woman as the temptress. Normal human sexual drives portrayed as sinful. A man tormented to the point of committing multiple murders by what is very likely the normal sex drive of a 21-year-old. Nancy Wang Yuan, a sociology professor at Viola University, tells us that removing racism from the conversation around the Atlanta spa shootings ignores the history of hypersexualization and fetishization of Asian women. Viola Liuzzo's story also falls into this intersectionality, although in a different way, of racism and the toxic rejection of healthy sexuality in US culture. The events of the Selma rights marches, including Bloody Sunday on March 7, 1965, were broadcast directly into our homes via television. Family members of all ages, I was a small child, watched in horror as peaceful protesters were beaten, attacked by dogs, and tear gassed. From the many topics we could have reflected on today, I had to choose, we only have about 20 minutes, around what to talk about with the deaths in Selma. And I want to hold up Viola Liuzzo's experience. Gender exclusion has made the story of Viola Liuzzo less visible. In honor of Women's History Month, I would like to focus on her story. She was not there to only protest, but to support the right of African Americans to register to vote. She suffered what has been called a double death. First her murder, and then an orchestrated character assassination. In early March of 1965, Dr. Martin Luther King had called on people of all faiths to join the march in Selma after the death of African American protester Jimmy Lee Jackson. By telling the story of Liuzzo, we do not minimize the trauma, the serious and permanent injury that so many people suffered during the Selma protests of 1965, including injury to beloved Representative John Lewis. And those injuries stayed with him his entire life. In addition to Jimmy Lee Jackson and Viola Liuzzo, UU minister Reverend James Reeb was killed. Liuzzo's story, however, holds some particularly sinister twists and turns. The two white UUs, as Dave mentioned in our introduction, knew the risks of traveling south for the protests. They chose to leave their families for what was meant to be only a few days to march for justice with Dr. King. James Reeb's story is most often told. He was leaving a restaurant with two other UU ministers when a group of Ku Klux Klansmen attacked them. Reeb was hit in the head. The other two UU ministers were beaten and kicked. It was obvious that Reeb was in serious condition. There was difficulty in getting him to the hospital in a timely way, and he died 2 days after the attack. He left behind a wife and 4 children. Viola Liuzzo was a mother of 5 children and was shot by night riders the evening of the last march. Liuzzo and Reeb, as UU social justice workers, made the ultimate sacrifice to help with voting rights. I ask each of you to remember the time, or maybe the series of events that woke you up and called you to social justice work, and to perhaps share your memories with someone later today. For me, there was a moment of crystal clarity when I was 15. Now, Rancho Alameda's high school in Garden Grove had a career day. I was a different young person at that time than the tiny child of the 1950s. A few days before my 9th birthday, I happened to be homesick the day John F. Kennedy was assassinated. My cartoons interrupted, I witnessed as close to real time as you could get the death of our president as it unfolded on television. When I was 15, one of my brothers was serving in the military on a ship during the Vietnam War. Another sibling had just come out as a gay man and was navigating his military obligations and his personal newly found life as an activist. The safe, comfortable world that my parents had hoped to recreate in our home in Garden Grove, mimicking the small Midwestern towns where they grew up, these mythical places no longer existed. Even in the suburbs of Garden Grove, Bob Dylan's words were echoing, and the times, they were a-changing. I don't remember Rancho's career day very well, except for one session. How radical feminists had been invited to this suburban high school career day is a question I can't answer. But there they were. My 15-year-old self listened to these dynamic young women, and I had an incredible moment of revelation. All the inequities I had experienced in my own world seemed explained by second wave feminism. The war my beloved brothers were unwillingly participating in fit within a larger pattern of accepted male and societal aggression. Issues with my parents, my own troubles, my increasing angst through my late teen years could all be viewed through this new lens. I read and I read and I read, and I was changed by what I read, and it seemed that my vision had cleared. That reading led to insights in other areas. I had several new lenses with which to see and understand the larger world. And I'm sure each of you has a story. My feminist understanding, which has led to my other involvements as a progressive, has been shaped and changed over the years. Marrying a liberal man and being with him over decades, raising a daughter and a son, has very much shaped my feminism. But feminist I remain to this day. Reading Viola Liuzzo's story struck a very sad chord for me, and the words of the Atlanta spa shooter also resonated in a very hard and hurtful way. I was taken back immediately to the bad old days of the patriarchy of the mid 20th century, well before the modern Me Too movement, a blow that landed viscerally in the pit of my stomach. To better understand the story of Viola Liuzzo, I was assisted by the writing of Mary Stanton, who was an 18-year-old woman when Liuzzo was killed. Horrified, Stanton watched as the murder victim was first honored as a civil rights martyr, then vilified. In her book, From Selma to Sorrow, The Life and Death of Viola Liuzzo, Stanton describes the first days after the Selma marches. The media took only days to completely transform Viola Liuzzo from a murder victim to an outside agitator and a symbol of female defiance. The hatred with which people attacked her, white people, especially white women, frightened me. Their anger at her seemed out of proportion to what she had done. She'd gone on a freedom march and she'd gotten herself killed. Why was everybody so angry, she asked. What had happened was a layered story of a complex woman and a horrific miscarriage of justice, that intersectionality of racism and gender. Viola Liuzzo answered the call to Selma in her own way. A strong advocate for racial civil rights. Her religious background was Catholic, but she also belonged to the local UU church. She had been divorced once and was free-thinking and independent, all threats to conservative middle-class white America mid-century. She joined the 20,000 peaceful protesters who responded to Dr. King's call to the march. She and a young African-American man, Leroy Moten, a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and other drivers were offering rides to those who needed assistance getting home or to the airport or other places after the days of protest. It's the last day in the evening. A car pulled alongside as Liuzzo and Moten were returning to pick up more people, and someone in the pursuing car shot Viola Liuzzo full on in the head. Leroy Moten grabbed the wheel of the car and moved it off the road. The men came to check on them, and Moten, covered in Liuzzo's blood, played dead. And after the men left, he ran to get help. The story of Liuzzo's murder, while horrible, seemed fairly straightforward. However, irregularities and inconsistencies from the police and the FBI reports soon became apparent. The FBI made arrests within hours of the attack. Years later, the Liuzzo children demanded to see the FBI records from their mother's case, and they have pieced together a very different story than the one that was presented at the trials of the Klansmen. One of the men, Gary Thomas Rowe, was an FBI informer. Rowe was a man who had a Klan history prior to his recruitment into the FBI. Rowe claimed that someone else in the car shot Liuzzo, but later on, under oath, the other men swore that Rowe was the person who fired the shots. Immediately after Liuzzo was killed, the dictatorial director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, found out that Rowe had warned the FBI of possible violence by these very Klansmen, and no one followed up on the tip. Everyone under oath threw everybody else under the bus in the cover-up of the incompetence that led to Viola Liuzzo's death. J. Edgar Hoover protected the FBI involvement in deadly mistakes by intentionally smearing Viola's character and leaking lies to the press and to the Klan. In a matter of days, Viola Liuzzo was transformed from a passionate, dedicated civil rights activist into a depraved drug addict who deserted her children and husband to have sex with African-American men. 19-year-old activist Leroy Moton was also victimized by this hypersexualization and slanderous assumptions. Already traumatized, Moton was repeatedly accused and implicated as her lover. Her autopsy, which showed none of these things had happened, was discounted. The press dragged her name through the muck and implicated her husband in mob activities. This was all instigated at the top level of the FBI through J. Edgar Hoover. Her brave family was tormented and harassed. The Southern press was merciless to her memory. Once again, a woman had been asking for it. The local sheriff of Selma was criticized for not acting on the tip that the car full of Klansmen was planning trouble. The sheriff blamed the FBI, but he also said to the press that, like Liuzzo, he had 5 children, but on the night of her killing, his wife was with their children at home where she belonged. Viola Liuzzo was called a race traitor, and her memory was repeatedly shamed as a woman who got what she deserved. Mary Stanton describes the hours after Liuzzo's death. When Mrs. Liuzzo's shattered body was taken to the state laboratory in Montgomery, the first thing the lab had been asked to do was to test to determine if she had recently had intercourse. Moton, a terrified teenager afraid of being killed while being held for his own safety for the trials, was asked repeatedly on the witness stand if he had any physical contact with Liuzzo. In the wake of the smear campaign against Viola after her death, a Klan cross was burned in front of the Liuzzo home in Detroit. Her children were called names at school, and classmates threw rocks at 6-year-old Sally, who you saw in the recording. When I saw this interview that we saw with the Liuzzo family, the whole thing, I encourage everyone to go take a look at it. The adult children, the way they were, I was transfixed in the video. They seem not only to have survived, but to be thriving. Mary mentions earlier, in the recording, that she has had a wonderful life. And it begs the question, how do we get past horrible trauma? Should we get past horrible trauma? I believe that for our own sakes, a radical acceptance of what has happened is necessary to move forward. Some folks offer forgiveness, but for me, as I struggle with acts of evil in the world, a simple acceptance of what happened and then a plan to move forward in a healthy way, based on my own Buddhist background, is the best path. The Liuzzo siblings, with the gift of time, have become so loving, and they, as a family, made a choice to find out the truth, no matter how painful, accept that truth, and then to proclaim it. They chose to move forward and to actively reclaim their mother's memory with all its beauty and very human, multi-layered complexity. The death of Jimmy Lee Jackson, Liuzzo, and Reeb at the Selma marches served as a catalyst for President Lyndon Johnson to send the new Voting Rights Act to Congress. We saw this week how voting rights continue to be challenged in states like Georgia, with the disgraceful arrest of Representative Park Cannon for simply knocking on the governor's door during the signing of this new restrictive state voting law. Dismantling racism is not an easy task. For many, the deaths of Liuzzo and Reeb continue to unfairly overshadow the struggles and voices of African Americans. What of the years of cruelty, brutality, and murder that African Americans and people of color continue to experience in this country? May the work we're doing today, allies in those directly experiencing racial oppression, bring about real change. At Reverend Reeb's memorial, Dr. King eulogized in the following words. So in his death, James Reeb says something to each of us, Black and white alike, says that we must substitute courage for caution, says to us we must be concerned not merely about who murdered him, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy that produced the murder. Reeb's death says to us we must work passionately, unrelentingly to make the American dream a reality so that he did not die in vain. In listening to this and other recordings of Liuzzo's children who've been on their own journey, I hear that respect for the UU principles, the interdependent web of life, and for the inherent worth and dignity of each person. Today, they speak about their mother in very loving terms and how their lives were molded and continue to be shaped by her life and by her death. I find myself inspired by their down-to-earth acceptance of the past and their generosity of spirit combined with activism, a rare combination. For me, that fiery young feminist from Garden Grove has been tempered over time. But I call on that youthful spirit of feminist change when certain events happen, as they have in the past 10 days. I'm so glad that we as Unitarian Universalists embrace all of our being with healthy views of our bodies using curricula like Our Whole Lives or OWL, and its wonderful offshoot in the LA area, More Than Sex Ed. More Than Sex Ed has expanded the OWL curricula and offered it to school-age children and youth, teaching acceptance, sexual boundaries, and values. In remembering Viola Liuzzo's life, may we all be inspired and go forward. Ways to honor her memory are to work to save voting rights and support programs for children and women all over the world. The events of the last 10 days have been stark reminders once again, we can't take any of our freedoms for granted. As Dr. King said, we need to address the system, the way of life, the philosophy that produced all of these events. We can also honor, hold up, celebrate, and respect the very best in ourselves and all our siblings on this crowded, complex, broken, and beautiful earth. May it be so.